This podcast is part of the Spoon Podcast Network, home of smart conversations that feed your mind.
What if the way we cultivate and fund our global food system could save us all? I'm Eva Goulbourne, and welcome to Everything But the Carbon Sink, a podcast that delves into the exciting and sometimes messy intersection of food, climate, and the money that could change everything. Here with me today is Renée Vassilos, Director of Agriculture Innovation at the Nature Conservancy. For those of you who are not familiar with TNC, which I'll refer to them as that moving forward in this conversation, they are a leading global environmental nonprofit focused and dedicated on conserving land, water, on which all life depends. So all of us can thank TNC, if we are humans living, breathing on this planet, for the amazing work that they do. They operate in over 70 countries to address critical challenges like climate change, surprise, surprise, as part of this conversation, biodiversity loss, water scarcity through science-backed solutions, community engagement, and innovative partnerships. So hopefully none of us are surprised that we have Renée with us today. Thank you for being with us, Renée.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited for the conversation.
So one of the things that I wanted to sort of tease out with you in this conversation and why your perspective in this work is so unique is, my podcast is about exploring the investment, the dollars in this space. You work for, as I just said, a huge global nonprofit. We don't typically think about nonprofits as being investors in this space. So I, want to sort of acknowledge that and make sure that that's exactly, in my mind, the type of innovative partnerships and innovative investment models that's needed at the systems level. And so I want to be able to get into that with you. But first, before we sort of get into the function of the work that you do, I want you to take us through sort of setting the stage for why ag matters so much in climate right now, and why is agriculture center to the climate conversation, and a little bit more about your focus in particular on regenerative agriculture within that.
Yeah, so big picture, according to the research that we've done and probably is familiar to this audience, agriculture has a tremendous negative footprint in terms of greenhouse gas emission production, and is also uniquely positioned to be a carbon sink. So there's a unique position with agriculture to reduce its footprint, which often maybe sometimes there's some misunderstanding, but the largest footprints are coming from the inputs that are coming and being put on the farm. So that's a tremendous part of the footprint, but then also the pressure agriculture has and the role that agriculture is playing in deforestation. So it is these two that are really big critical footprints. And so there's an opportunity to really to look at that role that agriculture has and think about solutions where we can continue to feed, fuel, and clothe the planet with a different footprint. Really thinking about how we can reimagine how agriculture is done, and that's how that's where regenerative agriculture comes in. So how can we use what the research has told us around practices that have the potential to reduce the carbon footprint, first of all, and then also to amplify the carbon sequestration opportunity that could play a big role, or in the role that agriculture can play for planetary health when it comes to climate change mitigation.
Thanks, Renée. And as part of that too, and I think hearing from you also just the reminder of, for some people, it's like, well, duh, of course we know the role that ag plays in climate, and a lot of people don't, and that's okay. And, and that's sort of the demystifying in a conversation like this, especially because whenever I'm looking at sort of those like pie charts of how ag contributes to greenhouse gas emissions versus like infrastructure and energy, it's like ag uses all of those things. Like, it's not just sort of this miraculous own juggernaut of energy that doesn't even relate to all of those other ones. So I think just that reminder of how deeply connected they are. One of the things that I'd love to hear more from you about too, is you mentioned specifically regen ag. This one feels messy for some people because it is not, there's practices, there's values, there's a lot of sort of, and obviously there's different contexts with which you use different regenerative practices based on, crop, soil, geography. How do you look at regenerative, and how do you sort of break that down?
Yeah, I like to, Nicole Masters. I'm a big Nicole Masters fan. She's an agronomist that supports producers in shifting their operations towards more regenerative operations. And something she talks about is the underground livestock. So sometimes how I like to think about regenerative agriculture is that we are paying attention to the soil microbiome, which is an incredibly robust, can be healthy ecosystem of extraordinary levels of life and support for agriculture systems. So at the core of how we think about regenerative agriculture, it is about soil health. It's about rebuilding soil health, because as we think about the role agriculture can play in climate change mitigation, halting and reversing biodiversity loss, and improving freshwater systems, it all anchors around rebuilding soil health. So then more specifically, what we think about when we think about regenerative agriculture are the production practices that scientific research have proven are critical for rebuilding soil health. I will list some of them. They're not exclusive. And this is where it is true. It is more gray. So acres under cover crop, acres under minimal till, increased rotation, input optimization on the grazing land side, the scaling of regenerative grazing land management plans. Agroforestry is another one that's really growing in importance. We are at the Nature Conservancy, we're really building a body of work around that. And then edge of field is very critical. There's a growing body of research around different farm and ranch operation, and really thinking about within someone's specific operation, where are there areas that would have outsized impact on runoff, potentially carbon sequestration if you were to convert it into agroforestry, because it's not as productive of a row crop acreage. So edge of field is another practice. The reason I would say, and this is where the reason investment is absolutely critical, is that there will not be a perfect blueprint or definition of regenerative agriculture that everyone can reference, because it will depend on an operation. So it really depends on someone's specific operation, maybe at a geographic level, but it is not a one-size-fit-all definition of what it looks like. Each operation will have to, if they're anchoring themselves in rebuilding soil health, then the tools that they'll be using to do that will vary and depend on what makes the most sense for where they are.
Thank you. And yeah, that's helpful to just know that it's very many specific and concrete examples, but then ultimately the context is really important. We're going to talk in a second about TNC's investment portfolio, your thesis in that work as well. But before we go there, everything that you've said makes complete sense. And, we're thinking like, oh gosh, yeah, everybody wants biodiversity. Everybody wants to be able to eat, right? Like, why is this so complicated? And, this idea of regenerative, as you're describing it, sounds like, oh my goodness, like this is the antidote. What is so, what's the big deal about, resisting this? And on the other side, we know, for those of us who've had the great privilege of working with farmers, working on farms in, our interactions, farmers don't think like that. There isn't and to be fair, many people who work land, of course, want to be able to protect it. They are stewards of that land. And they may already be doing what we're considering, quote unquote, regenerative ag practices without telling everybody and their mother about it. But from their perspective, it's either obvious for them to be able to, engage in those practices, or there may be this friction of top-down sort of assignment to the farmer, as if they are this singular being that's being, sort of told, this is what you have to do, without considering the cost, the even the knowledge, the fact that many farmers are part of multi-generational farms that no longer have the younger generation because they've gone to the city or gone on to do other things. What is, from the farmer's perspective, the business case and the excitement for them through the lens of, you can tell me about, long-term gains all you want, but I'm looking at the weather, I'm looking at the soil, I'm looking at the water that I have, and I'm not taking any risks that I don't have to.
Yeah. So I would say one critical piece, this is something that we've been working on, is that we cannot lump farmers into a single segment. And so you touched on it a little bit in your introduction, but we have folks who are growing feed, which is going to livestock. We have folks that are growing fuel, that is biofuel, so corn for ethanol, soy for soy diesel, soybeans for soy diesel. You have those that are growing cotton for fiber. All of these, the economics behind all of those operations are very different. So I would say it all comes down to the economics. And then digging deeper, there are different economics depending on whether or not you have someone who is a majority owner operator. Do they own their land and operate the most of it?
Yeah.
Or is their operation a mix of a smaller percentage of owned land and a significant percentage of rented acres? That also totally changes your appetite for actually introducing these practices and the risk profile. So getting back to your point, your point about risk. So the drivers, so what we've seen, and then there are producers who have shifted towards more regenerative operations, certainly. And so I think for most of those operations, you would see there was an economic driver to do so. That it's something about their operation. My guess is that the majority are producing food, which is the highest margin of the things that we just listed. It's the highest margin. So for those that are producing food, it was an economic case. We just did a sprint 2 weeks ago, and we spoke with a couple. We spoke with two different farmers, a design sprint to understand how we can scale crop diversification in the upper Mississippi foodscape. We had a large scale row crop operator, and then a smaller, greater than 2,000 acres, and then a smaller sub 1,000 acres. I might be a little bit off there. The one couple sub 1,000 acres, they had committed themselves to wanting to work solely on the farm. They wanted to make this operation work so that they both could have incomes on the farm. So that necessitated them really diversifying their operation and getting towards high margin crops, food crops, specialty food crops. The other farmer that we interviewed, she and her partner had always worked off farm. So their focus was really just in continuing to keep the land in farming and doing what was viable for the limited hours they had to dedicate to farming. So just two examples of how you just are presented with and so they were traditional corn and soybean producers. And so you're just very different economics. So I would say, but what is the underlying driver for where we have seen change? It's economic.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's two helpful examples too. And I think also reveals just how complex that is, to your point about, do they own the land, or are they majority landholders? Is it leasehold? And then of course the crops, as you're saying. Sort of a perfect segue, as you're saying, it's all about the economics. And heck yeah, I'm always trying to figure out who pays for that. Because again, of course, this opportunity, it sounds like, oh my gosh, like why wouldn't anybody do this? But again, we're dealing with harvest cycles. We're dealing with, truly what needs to be patient capital or really catalytic financing models. Tell us about TNC's investment work. What is the thesis for the work that you do in this space, and sort of how that ties into your investment around early stage regen ag companies?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, you're right. Why wouldn't someone do this? Is exactly where we're rooted in trying to scale action, to accelerate progress towards more operations actually adopting these practices, the ones that make sense, again, for their particular operation. So at the Nature Conservancy, we have teams that are boots on the ground that work directly with farm communities. They work with agriculture retailers, which are a critical part of the system. We have folks that are working with the lending institutions. We have folks that are working at kind of many different stages within the agriculture
and sorry
value
to
chain.
interrupt, Renee, just to clarify too, working with, is that primarily through capacity building and technical assistance, or what's usually, okay.
Yeah, what you might see is more traditional, what you might expect more traditionally from a Nature
I don't know,
Conservancy
yeah.
or other nonprofits in the space. Exactly. So it's
Thank you.
and we had what we realized was we'd set our goals, a very aggressive goal of moving the needle on 50% of US acres towards these regenerative practices by 2030. And we recognized that literally the status quo technology solutions that farm operations have at their disposal are not sufficient to get us there. It was this recognition that if we wanted to accelerate progress on adoption, we also had to foster the development of tools that made it, I use Bill Gates's language here, we needed to foster the development of tools that eliminates the green premium so that it makes business sense for the vast majority of operations to do these practices, whether they want to be sustainable or not. It's just the right business decision. So that is the underlying thesis that we have, is how can we identify and support the development of solutions that eliminate the green premium. And then more specifically, our investment thesis is very tactical. So we look for solutions that will scale one of those 5 practices that I had listed earlier. So are there technologies out there that have the potential to reduce the roadblocks, challenges that are preventing the adoption of the regenerative practices on farm? So I'll share, we have 8 companies in the portfolio. I'll share, I'm trying to think, I'll share one example. We invested in a company called Swarm Farm. I was with John Deere for a decade, so I love equipment.
Oh, yes, that's right. I forgot to mention that to the audience, that you know a thing or two about heavy machinery on a farm landscape.
Exactly. So I love equipment. So one of the companies that we invested in was Swarm Farm, which is an autonomous tractor company. And one of the challenges that we saw is that there's an abundance of agronomic evidence. So the agronomics are there around reducing the application of fall tillage. We also have economic evidence that suggests it makes a whole lot of sense to reduce your fall nitrogen application. This is the input optimization practice that we're looking to scale. The reality is we do not see folks in field cutting back, despite what we would argue is very strong evidence that it doesn't make sense to be doing these fall applications. There's multiple challenges there. Some are logistics and storage. So nitrogen is more abundant and cheaper in the fall. So there's some components there. So that's a logistics challenge. But the other challenge is that the equipment that exists, so what John Deere and Case New Holland and some of the other major manufacturers keep putting out, is large, really large scale equipment that is expensive and requires labor. Expensive from a soil compaction perspective because they're very heavy, and then also from a labor perspective, it's very expensive to be going out in those machines. And the reality is, when you're trying to implement a more precise nitrogen strategy, it might mean that you're going into the field more often, not less often, but your total application is more optimized. With that big bad equipment, it's too costly from both a labor and a soil compaction perspective. And so most producers are not implementing a precision system. The numbers just do not work out because of labor, severe costs of labor, and then also trying to manage soil compaction. So Swarm Farm is a husband and a wife team out of Australia that is developing smaller, fully autonomous. Swarm Farm, as the name suggests, you would be putting out multiple units in the field that are really working to make it a cost-effective solution for large-scale row crop operations to implement a precision system. So they're really trying to address that precision system. I have 7 other companies, and I could tie back to kind of the challenge that we see and the solutions that they're trying to bring, but perhaps we'll have a chance to share another example.
Yeah, and thank you for providing that one. And yes, I'm going to want another one in a second, but I think that really demonstrates very tactically, as you were saying, the types of investments that you make, and literally down to the ground level in terms of that decision of do I want to smush my soil and, disrupt this beautiful biome? And, or do I have to train X amount of people or send multiple people out, a variety of different times, which, labor, as we know, is one of the most, expensive inputs into all of this work. A question that I have for you about that too, in terms of the opportunity it's swarm farm that you said.
Yeah.
What are some of the objections that they see in, I imagine, like scaling the, the actual machinery itself, the marketing, the production? What are some of the key challenges that and maybe this is even relevant to your other portfolio companies, in terms of the obstacle that they have in terms of scaling and getting financing for what, again, seems to be like this antidote to this very linear problem?
Yeah, so in general, the agriculture system, when you look at the agriculture value chain, it's an incredibly it's severely lacking in competition. So when you look at the equipment space, you have John Deere and Case IH. I think it could be argued that globally they probably own over 60% market share. That's a duopoly. Seeds and inputs, Syngenta and Bayer, you would probably say that they might also be above that 60% market share space. Post-harvest, you have Cargill and ADM. It's likely that they're also playing in that duopoly role. And so there is very little pressure on the incumbents to innovate. And there's a tremendous amount of reason to prevent innovation. So I think some of the challenges and roadblocks are the realities of the agriculture value chain, and the Nature Conservancy works with corporate partners. So we recognize they also play an important role in the system. But when you're really talking about how we're going to see disruption and new innovation, they present often from an acquisition perspective, the opportunity, but also a lot of the challenges in terms of their pace of change, identifying the opportunities when they see them, and kind of expediting trialing or testing of these solutions. So I would argue some of the biggest challenge comes from the reality of the current value chain and the players in the space.
Yeah, and as you said, the incumbents have no motivation to innovate, which again, on the other side, I'm like, what? That makes also zero sense in terms of, what we're up against from an environmental, perspective, and just objectively, you'd think that they would all be scrambling to innovate and understand how to, adjust their machinery and offerings and, their inputs for this changing like physical landscape.
And so there's certainly innovation happening, but not at the pace that we see in the early ag tech. So there is, I would say, maybe more iteration than the like true disruptive innovation, right? There is a lot of iteration that's happening. And in terms of, to your point, what is driving some of that? It is some of the pressures that we have. So climate change volatility makes it so that the existing suite of tools that they've had in their toolkit just are not delivering. Herbicide and pesticide resistance are severe problems and getting worse. So that means the literal toolkit isn't working. Increasing droughts, right? So a lot of seed development had been focused, is it keeping pace with the realities of drought and wet cycles? On the equipment side, we are also seeing labor, again, coming back to labor as being a severe constraint that is driving investment in automation, forcing that innovation. So there are some other tailwinds that are starting to come that are forcing the innovation. But I guess perhaps nothing is as fast as I would like to see the change. But and then often, of course, regulatory is a way that you would see pressure, and we simply don't have that in the there just isn't very much regulatory pressure in the United States. In Europe, and then of course a lot of these are global companies, so it's not as if they're immune or not paying attention to what's happening in Europe. But often North America, South America are the bigger markets.
Yeah. Okay. That's helpful to know. And I want to come back to that one if we have a little time too, because I have a lot of questions for you on that. Taking actually a step back for a second here too. In many ways, like, of course, the investment thesis that you have, and, you know, given the landscape that you've described, it's absolutely necessary for you to be injecting capital into this space to, as you were saying, accelerate innovation just more efficiently. Even understanding, again, it's very uncommon, at least from my knowledge, to have a nonprofit operate in that role. How did this come about for TNC to start investing? Where do those dollars come from? And do you have co-investors, or even maybe off-takers who may not invest with you now, but given your sort of ability to reimagine the supply chain, what, you know, you have even mentioned, obviously you have lots of corporate partners. How do they stack up in this opportunity for you so that it is this cohesive approach?
Yeah. So it came about through a very progressive donor that challenged us to say, okay, TNC, your traditional work is required. You need to keep being boots on the ground, supporting with technical assistance, and you need to influence the technology space, the innovative solutions. And so
Okay, so
we received a
technology was back
recoverable
in the
grant.
space.
Yeah, we received a recoverable grant from a very progressive donor, and we have been investing through a group called iSelect out of St. Louis.
Hmm.
They have an evergreen structured fund so that they're actually raising capital for each individual investment from their customers. So then the Nature Conservancy is one customer. We are looking at the investments. So we're not managing this from a fund perspective. We're not managing for fund outcomes. We're looking at each individual investment for impact first, and then the scalability. So for us, what we're really trying to tie together here is that these technologies are not successful if they don't deliver farm profitability and the environmental outcomes. Like we've got to see, and then of course they have to be viable businesses. They have to have the potential to scale.
Yeah.
And so these are non-concessionary investments. We're investing alongside other venture investors. We're investing, of the 8 companies, 6 were Series A companies, 2 were Series B companies.
Okay.
For some of them, so we have not we have not yet brought kind of connected the dots between our investments and the corporate partners, but what we have started to do is to recognize that what differentiates the Nature Conservancy as an investor is not only sitting in the investor seat with this information that we have that most of our peers don't have around this very tactical knowledge about what are the challenges and roadblocks on farm and on ranch. And then through that knowledge is how we make investments. So one of our goals has always been through our active seat to influence other investors to say, this is the impact that we're looking for. This is why this particular solution can help circumvent or disrupt the challenge that we see to input optimization, for example, with Swarm Farm again.
Yeah.
But what we recognized about 2.5 years in was that what also differentiates the Nature Conservancy is our ability to actually test the solutions in which we've invested. What other
You have
investors
all those
have this
relationships on the ground.
exactly brilliant colleagues, relationships that can set up pilots. And so after about 2.5 years, we stood up a pilot. And so we've run 3 pilots of 2 of the technologies and we invested in. To test those technologies again for the impact that we're seeking and the farm and ranch profitability. One was in the row crop scenario, one was a grazing lands solution. So that's kind of how we're trying to bring this all together and how we see the Nature Conservancy as a differentiated investor. Like, why are we sitting on the table? Well, it's to bring the knowledge that we have around our investment thesis and why particular solutions are valuable. And then it's to this unique opportunity that we have to actually test the solutions for the impact and the profitability outcomes.
Yeah, which is huge and hugely unique. How are you received in the investor community? And do you feel like you're more of the style of a grant maker, a venture philanthropist, or, you know, are you like a Silicon Valley VC dude on the other side of the spectrum? What's the experience of operating with these other investors?
I would say that would be so interesting to survey what people think. I think my observation would be that I'm put more of an impact investor category, that I'm kind of put into a category of impact investor, highly informed and specialized is how I think folks probably, and how I sense our interactions are. When we are invited to speak, it is often as an investor. So that's often we're on panels
Okay.
and stuff. So
Yeah.
it is taking an investor seat. We also had some good evidence where there was a $5 billion planetary health fund that was being launched. And I was tapped, I was on the short list to join their advisory board, which to me was kind of, you have all this ideas about what you're doing, but that was just real evidence of, oh, this is being seen in the marketplace as valuable. And so it's not scalable to have me sitting on advisory board seats, right? Like that's not a scalable way to really accelerate our outcomes. But what
you can't be in like 100 places at once all the time.
Funnily enough, not, but it was kind of the evidence that I needed to say, oh, it's working. To have been on that short list was really a testament to, oh, the market sees value in this. And so that was really exciting. And we've actually we are currently fundraising for Fund 2. And the third component of our strategy, invest, pilot, but the third component that we're building out is knowledge sharing. So it is to try to address,
great,
how can we actually scale? It's not sitting on individual, investment committee seats or advisory board seats, but it is us getting to a more proactive, professional way of capturing and sharing the knowledge that we have from our investor seat and also from the pilots. So that's the piece that we're working on. I call it my Fund 2, my pilot that's baked into Fund 2 is how do we serve the investor community at scale.
Yeah, which is so like that in and of itself is just an invaluable value proposition for what you've built within TNC on that as well. So I'm encouraged. You said Fund 2. How big is that, and when is it being created, and how does it compare to Fund 1?
So officially fundraising for it now, it's 10 million. So we started with 2 million. This one would be 10 million. And we have the first million committed and are actively fundraising for the rest. The difference is, so it will still be it will be continuing that two-pronged strategy of invest and pilot. So the investing is traditional investment capital. The pilots are with grant dollars. So we support the pilots through what we call innovation grants. And that's non-dilutive capital to support. And then building out the knowledge share component is the other part of Fund, I say in quotation marks, because it's not a traditional fund, but a Fund 2.
That's great. And I love hearing that there's already so much evolution and learning to sort of create and optimize the next version. In a moment, I want to talk to you about this, again, this like blended finance moment and opportunity, even the fact that there was this very forward-thinking private philanthropy donor that pushed you and inspired you and challenged you to create this is so unbelievably uncommon. So I want to get to that in one second. But as I understand, the fund in your work is optimizing on technology. So as I'm hearing from you too, that's everything from like the hardware and software and the heavy machinery, that's the biologicals, that's, everything. How do you sort of make sense and prioritize or maybe even sequence how all of those solutions are scaled through your investments and how you look at them of course, they're eventually going to be looked at holistically, but they are quite disparate in terms of what the actual solution is.
Yeah, if you look our portfolio, I was actually quite you go into this with ideas of what it would look like, but I'm actually really pleased with how the portfolio came to be. It is exactly as you suggest, a very diverse set of solutions. There's an equipment play, there's an alternative to synthetic nitrogen, there's a platform play. So it is incredibly diverse. Yeah. There's a fintech company. I think the way we have been thinking about this is that there are currently headwinds, as you kicked off, right? We just are not seeing adoption as fast as we would like. And so the way we are thinking about this is that the portfolio is a great reflection of all the different type of solutions that are going to be required to see us to that future that we're going for. And so I don't know that I or anyone has a secret sauce into like how are those 8 solutions, for example, going to sequence to get us there. But what I can say is that they are all needed. These types of solutions, something that is addressing the financial risks that operations have to taking on to taking on these changes is going to be needed. Alternatives to the existing suite of synthetic solutions are going to be needed. We also invested in pattern ag, which is an infrastructure play. So as we've been thinking about biologicals more broadly, one of the challenges we saw wasn't maybe the right role for the Nature Conservancy to try to pick biological winners necessarily, but what we could support is the infrastructure to be testing biologicals at scale, right? So how can we support that underlying infrastructure to scale up the adoption of biologicals? So I would say, I don't know that we've taken kind of a sequencing approach, but really more of a systems lens on what are all the types of roadblocks and challenges, and then can we identify some technologies that might start to disrupt, circumvent, or mitigate some of those challenges. I think
that was a great response to a very difficult question, by the way.
Yeah.
And yeah, that makes total sense in terms of, I mean, it's like picking, favorites amongst your kids. You can't quite do it, maybe on different days, but it makes it more challenging. On the same sort of thread of those different solution types, I've learned feed, food, fuel, fiber from you, which, as you've articulated, and I think is a helpful reminder for us that our ag system is not just for you and me to eat. It's not that beautiful farm that's outside my window, and it's not only for for animals as well. How and even the fact that you were talking about ethanol and I didn't even know that you could make oil from soy, but I guess that makes total sense because soybean oil. How do you make sense of feeding people, feeding animals, feeding our fashion, basically, as you were saying, cotton and that sort of thing, and renewable energy, and how you're looking at sort of, again, prioritizing amongst all of those critically important audiences?
I think it comes back to, so using the portfolio as an example. So we've 8 different technology solutions within the portfolio. I think as you imagine the different operations that are growing those different types of crops, they all have different margin. And so what is likely is that it is the higher margin operations that are able to start changing how they're operating sooner. So I think it's really thinking about, and then also I'm now challenging myself because it will also depend on how severe the headwinds they have, right? Are they facing more severe climate volatility? So it will depend on how their operations, the pressure their operations are under, and whether or not it makes business sense to start adopting different practices. So it really comes back to what makes sense for their different operation, which is why, as we've looked at the solution set, we're really trying to identify solutions that make it for the lowest margin producers, for them to be able to also adopt these practices. That's what we've had our eye on. But in terms of how I think the adoption will actually happen, it will likely follow along with margins. Who is able.
And on that front, just to clarify too, because you're emphasizing on the operational level, which makes total sense, and in some ways, it feels like we have this opportunity with this system that's quite consolidated in terms of we're mostly talking wheat, corn, soy, cotton. Do you see any one of those specific crops as being more or less ripe for these types of innovations because either of margins or something else? Or is it really dependent on the specific geography, the specific operations, and you can't make any generalizations around the crop and market itself? I'm throwing you the tough
I
ones
know.
today.
I know. I'm sorry. I think it's tough to, and my mind is going to, there's also unknowns right now. So I would say it's that's difficult to answer, because it also depends on what different operations are experiencing in terms of climate change volatility. That's also not hitting operations equally. So there's another element beyond just their immediate markets that would influence whether or not they were changing practices. So I think that's a difficult one to answer.
That's totally fair. Again, I'm throwing you some hard ones because as you're thinking, I'm like, how would that work? I want to shift gears a little bit back to risk and investment and the role of philanthropy in this space. And then I want to end with you on I certainly need some hope and some optimism. And given you are an experienced practitioner in this space and also an experienced investor, I'm going to want you to leave some final brilliant thoughts about how and why we should be encouraged and still optimistic about where the world is, because please, I need it. But on the philanthropy and investment side, and this is like, I am like a truffle pig in northern Italy in the fall. I am laser focused on the fact that philanthropy must play a much more central role. And it's not an innovative or new idea. Obviously, that's literally what philanthropy is intended to do. But when we're talking about, and you demonstrated this so beautifully with, answering these questions and then some of them being like, well, I don't know, it really depends, just how complex our food and ag system is. And the business case is there, as you've said, and there's still reasons that corporates and larger companies are not coming to the table fast enough. So this opportunity to have philanthropy play a role. What are the 2 to 3 maybe suggestions or sort of invitations that if you could give to a philanthropist of like, look, they're like, Renée, I got $1 billion. I trust you implicitly. Where do I need to put my dollars? We already know it's going to be in food and climate because you're now the fund manager. Where do we need to tell philanthropy to put those dollars?
Oh God, this is my dream question. So I would first orient on what their North Stars are. So if their North Stars are human health or food and nutrition, then it would be to build out an investment thesis around what are the challenge and roadblocks very specifically around food and nutrition. So again, that would then have you laser focus on the operations that are growing food and would likely have you expand beyond the farm. So if your focus as a philanthropist was on food and nutrition, and then you would probably be looking at solutions to support farm operation, but you will also be looking at post-harvest, storage, aggregation, processing, platform development. How are you actually connecting those that are producing the healthy, nutritious food with the markets? So food and nutrition would be a tremendous amount of fun, and you would be focusing on the food producers, but you'd likely also be looking post-harvest. And so that's a lot of, that's not venture capital. That is not sexy processing equipment and storage solutions and marketplaces. Very important, not venture. Some venture, maybe again on the farm solutions, but you'd be looking to develop a as you said, a mixed capital solution.
Yeah.
If your North Stars are climate change mitigation, halting and reversing biodiversity and freshwater systems, planetary health, maybe this is something is talking about more, then you would be really looking at that whole ag system. And so then you might be taking more of this approach that we have at the Nature Conservancy and really trying to identify across the value chain, what are the roadblocks to actually seeing scale. To date, we really believe that is solutions that help the farm, because it all comes back to actually what's happening on the farm, eliminating the green premium for the farm. That might also mean supporting creative insurance solutions for CPG companies to be able to reduce their costs for engaging with their supply chain and improving their supply chain, or biofuel off-takers, right? So there's there's also a post-harvest play that's pretty severely underinvested. So I would probably be thinking about an investment thesis oriented on the North Star goals, and then really thinking, if you had a different forms of capital to put to work, what across the value chain, where the most, where the different resources are needed. But it would be
Wouldn't that be the best?
Yes, it would be my dream.
Well, let's manifest that. And I think maybe just digging a little deeper on that one before we close out to sort of the inverse of that question. What is like the hot potato or like the runt of solutions? And I mean very specifically of like, you can't get anybody to fund, like, we need to extend the size of the shovel, or we need to retrofit this tractor to do XYZ, or like, we can never get anybody to print the marketing materials to share with our farmers. What is like the ugliest baby in this space? Because the truth of the matter is, the least sexy in food and ag, for better or for worse, probably is the most impactful.
Yeah.
And so what is the ugly baby?
Gosh, that's a great question. I think on the technology side, we are seeing, so I would actually say I'm quite encouraged. So coming back to the optimism, I'm actually very encouraged about the solution set that I'm seeing in the market now, because where my mind is going is to addressing the severe labor challenge. It's not something that's talked about enough. But so I would say, though, it is not necessarily the ugly baby in that it's not getting investment. We haven't quite seen huge wins in that space in terms of, but it's coming. You have some very interesting companies that are developing solutions to start to address the labor risk. And a lot of the incumbents are also looking at how they can start delivering automation solutions. And this, just to be clear, sometimes there's some sensitivity. This is to address the lack of labor. This is not to address, in most cases, in most operations, we're starting to see just a severe lack of labor. And so it's not replacing existing jobs. It's to accomplish status quo work that has to get done, let alone the regenerative solutions. There are not enough people. And the other piece that we have to be honest about, that's sometimes difficult, is that these systems that we want to build, these regenerative systems, are more complex. And that can take different kinds of labor, possibly more labor. We have to be honest about that. And so that's why I'm really focused on the technology solutions to help mitigate that reality. We can't be living in kind of this utopian version of it, where we think that the labor and know-how exists to actually implement these complex systems. So it's not the ugly baby, but I would say addressing labor challenges is just absolutely critical. Yeah.
That's a good one. Maybe we'll call that the ugly duckling then, in that it's there and coming about with more awareness.
Yeah.
I want to close with just and one, thank you so much. And I have so much admiration for you, and you're just a wealth of knowledge. We didn't even get to policy, everything that you were just saying on the labor front too. We didn't even touch policy and regulation. We didn't even get out of the United States in this conversation. So my prediction is a part two. But you, in addition to everything that you've shared in the role that you play, are also, you wear many other hats in the rest of your realm. I'd love, just especially since there are not a lot of women in food and finance and investment, just to hear more about some of the other activities that you do in this space on your personal investment side.
Yeah, so I sit on the board of two companies. It was something we also didn't really touch on, was seeds. So one of the companies that I sit on the board of is called SeedLinked, which is absolutely critical. They're building the platform to actually start optimizing trialing. So one of the reasons we do not have a robust, diverse set of seeds currently in production, and that's a real gap for biodiversity and other reasons. But SeedLinked is building the platform to improve the trialing around seeds. I sit on the board of a company called GrainPro that is around post-harvest storage. That's very critical. That's more ex-US, but really important technology to improve how we store so we can maintain quality with less chemicals. Really critical. Maintain, store, and ship. Also, they've multiple solutions.
Okay, yeah.
I am a minority investor in Farmhead Ventures, which I know, Eva, that you're also a part of. That is very critical around labor, so addressing the labor challenges, trying to come up with solutions to address labor challenge. Personally, I've also been an investor with Golden Seeds, which is an angel investing group that supports female entrepreneurs. So it's not ag focused, but I'm very excited about any chance to support female entrepreneurs. I think that's my list. But yeah, I'm very I'm so excited that you're doing this podcast. It's very important, and I love the chance to have a conversation around ag tech is climate tech and how important it is.
I love how you just rattled off like 18 other different hats of yours just casually. You are a busy woman. I want to say thank you so much for being part of this conversation and, again, really demonstrating a unique sort of approach in this space. And yeah, just grateful for the great conversation. I want to thank our listeners for joining me for everything but the carbon sink on the Spoon Network. I hope this discussion inspires all of you to think differently about the intersection of food, climate, funding, and the role we all play in transforming our food system. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen and share your podcasts. And be sure to share with others who care about building a sustainable future. I'll look forward to seeing you all next time. And thank you again, Renée.